The alarm clock screamed at 5 a.m., a jagged sound that cut through the stagnant air of the room. Elias did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the hum of the cooling unit and the steady, rhythmic ticking of his own pulse. His limbs felt anchored to the mattress, heavy with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to drown out the reality waiting for him in the daylight. The unpaid bills sat in a precise, taunting stack on his desk just a few feet away. Every invoice represented a deadline he had missed, a promise he had failed to keep. The weight of them pressed against his chest, far heavier than the blankets. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and slapped the switch. The silence that rushed back into the room was colder than the alarm. He took a breath, tasted the stale air, and felt the familiar grinding fatigue pull at his joints. He sat up, his movements stiff and deliberate, and stared into the dark corner of the room where his ambition had once felt like a fire, now reduced to nothing but embers. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet hitting the cold floorboards. The floor creaked, a sharp sound in the stillness. Elias did not look at the mirror. He did not look for motivation. He walked to the desk, his movements slow and methodical. He pulled the chair out, the wood scraping against the floor, and sat down. The notebook lay open, the pages blank and waiting. He did not feel ready. He did not feel like a man with a future. He felt only the grinding, repetitive need to survive. He uncapped the pen, the smell of ink sharp in the morning air. His hand hovered for a second, then dropped. He wrote the first task, then the second, then the third. Each stroke of the pen was a calculated strike against the void. He did not wait for his pulse to quicken or his heart to swell with purpose. He simply finished the list, closed the notebook, and set the pen down in the exact center of the table. The silence of the room remained heavy, but the plan was set. He had anchored his day before the sun had even begun to rise. The ink on the page blurred as his mind drifted back to the years of aimless grinding. He remembered the fluorescent hum of a different office, a place where he spent 10 hours a day performing tasks that left no mark on the world. He was a fixture in the corner, a piece of furniture that breathed. Every morning, he watched the same cycle repeat. A manager would walk down the row of desks, stopping to offer a handshake or a nod to the people around him. Elias would hold his breath, hoping for a look, a task, or a sign of recognition. It never came. He watched his peers rise, their desks emptied as they moved to offices with windows, while he remained anchored to the same gray cubicle. They spoke of growth and strategy, their voices echoing off the walls, while he calculated the minutes until he could leave. He was a ghost in that room, watching the living operate with purpose while he drifted through the shifts. The air in that office felt thick, a suffocating layer of routine that kept him locked in place. He had become a spectator, observing a race he was not allowed to join, his potential shrinking with every passing hour of silence. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the dark parking lot. Elias sat with his hands locked at 10 and 2, staring at the blurred reflection of the streetlights on the windshield. He had nowhere to go. He had no errands, no plans, and no destination that mattered. He shifted his grip, his knuckles turning white against the plastic of the wheel. He looked at the passenger seat, then at the rearview mirror, and saw only a man waiting for instructions he would never receive. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow to the chest. He was not the driver of his own existence. He was a passenger, watching the scenery of his life pass by through a window he could not roll down. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool rim of the steering wheel, and closed his eyes. The silence of the car was no longer peaceful. It was a cage. He breathed in the scent of stale coffee and trapped air, feeling the narrow walls of his own inaction closing in. He had to stop moving in circles. He had to take the wheel, or he would simply cease to exist entirely. Elias started the ignition, the vibration buzzing through the floorboards. He drove not home, but to the first brightly lit storefront he found. He walked past the aisles, his eyes scanning until they landed on a stack of simple bound journals. He pulled one from the shelf, feeling the texture of the cover under his thumb. He bought it without a word, his movements mechanical and sharp. Once inside his apartment, he cleared a space on the table, pushing aside mail and empty plates. He opened the book, the spine cracking in the quiet room. The paper was stark white, empty, and demanding. He picked up a pen and hovered the tip over the first page. For a heartbeat, he froze. To write the goal was to commit to it, and that commitment felt heavier than he had anticipated. He pressed down, the ink bleeding into the fiber of the page. He wrote, "Build a software consultancy." He stared at the words. They were no longer just a flicker of a thought. They were a contract. The room felt smaller now, the air charged with the pressure of a path he had just carved for himself. He had started the clock. The schedule became a suffocating rhythm. Elias spent his daylight hours performing repetitive tasks for his employer, his focus drifting toward the logic puzzles waiting for him at home. The moment he crossed his threshold, he collapsed into the chair, but there was no rest. He opened the laptop, the screen light harsh against his eyes. His fingers moved across the keys, sometimes stiff, sometimes twitching with fatigue. He coded until his head felt heavy and his vision blurred into static. One night, his hand cramped so sharply he had to drop the pen and grip his wrist to stop the shaking. He looked at the clock. 1 a.m. He had to be up in 4 hours. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock of the temperature pulling him back into the task. He did not hit the bed. He sat back down. He returned to the screen, forcing his mind to map out the next function. Every line of code was an act of defiance against his own exhaustion. He was building a bridge out of his current life, brick by brick, hour by agonizing hour. He refused to let the fatigue stop him. Months bled into one another, marked only by the glow of the monitor. Elias worked in total silence. His progress remained invisible to the world outside his four walls. He walked through the city streets during his lunch break, watching groups of people laugh and share meals, their lives connected by shared moments he no longer possessed. He was a ghost in the machinery of the city. Back at his desk, he pushed his chair against the wall, the wood scraping against the floor, a sound that underscored the emptiness of the apartment. He checked his inbox every hour, waiting for a signal, a notification, or even a system error that would suggest someone else was interacting with his code. Nothing. The screen remained static. The lack of validation began to press against his ribs, a heavy, cold weight. He realized that no one was coming to check on his progress, and no one was waiting for him to succeed. He was the only witness to his own labor. He adjusted his position, the chair springs creaking in the stillness, and turned his attention back to the lines of logic. If he was to reach the other side, he had to survive the silence first. The cursor blinked, one pulse, then another. It was a steady, rhythmic taunt against the silence of the room. Elias stared until the white light burned into his retinas, leaving ghost images of the monitor when he blinked. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, motionless. A voice in his head, cold and precise, began to list the reasons for his failure. It told him he was chasing a phantom, that his time was leaking away into a bottomless well, and that he should simply close the laptop and sleep. The logic felt persuasive. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping sharply against the floorboards, and stood up. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Looking at the dark street below, he felt the weight of his own futility pulling at his limbs. It would be so easy to stop, to walk away, to let the project die in the dark. He gripped the edge of the window frame, his knuckles white, fighting the urge to walk out the front door and never look back at the desk. He took a long, ragged breath, turned around and marched back to the machine. He sat down. He placed his hands on the keys. He refused to listen to the doubt. He forced the cursor to move. A notification chimed on his phone, cutting through the hum of the cooling fan. Elias picked it up. A photograph of a friend, smiling, holding an award, with a caption announcing a promotion. The image hit him like a physical blow. A sharp, hot sensation radiated from his chest, tightening his throat. He looked at his own reflection in the darkened screen of his monitor, then back at the phone. His friend was moving forward, claiming a place in the world, while he remained trapped in this room, clutching at lines of code that promised nothing. He felt the sting of inadequacy, a bitter, biting heat that made his hands tremble. He threw the phone onto the bed, face down. He wanted to scream, to break something, to vent the pressure that had been building for months. Instead, he gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned gray. He sat back down. He pulled the keyboard toward him with a violent, jagged motion. He did not let the envy paralyze him. He used it. He forced his fingers to fly. Every key press became an outlet for his frustration. He typed with a new, frantic pace, turning the bitter taste of jealousy into a weapon. He worked until his eyes burned and the sun began to pale the edges of his curtains. The momentum stopped on a Tuesday. A line of code that had worked an hour before suddenly triggered a cascade of errors. Elias ignored it at first, assuming it was a minor syntax slip. He deleted it, rewrote it, and ran the compiler again. The red text flashed across the screen like a warning. He spent the next 3 hours dissecting the logic, tracing every variable, and checking every dependency. Nothing changed. By the end of the week, the error had become a phantom, shifting whenever he tried to pin it down. He tried rewriting the entire module from scratch. The bug migrated, reappearing in a different function, deeper in the architecture. He stopped sleeping, spending his nights scouring documentation and testing every configuration he could conceive. The error remained, an immovable stone in his path. He tried changing the framework entirely, but the foundation itself seemed to reject his inputs. 2 weeks bled into 3. Every time he pressed the enter key, the screen spat back the same failure message. It was a rhythmic, agonizing cycle of attempt, failure, and silence. His hands would shake as he typed the commands, knowing the result before the machine even processed it. The project was not just stalled, it was locked, and the walls of his workspace seemed to close in with every passing day of progress denied. The chair felt like an anchor. Elias looked at the screen, but the lines of code had ceased to be language. They were just jagged, incomprehensible patterns. He pushed his palms against his eyes, trying to rub away the strain, but the darkness behind his eyelids was no relief. The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to pulse, inching closer with every shallow breath he took. He reached for his water glass, his hand hovering in the air before dropping back to his lap, heavy as lead. The temptation was not a thought. It was a physical pressure in his chest, a demand to stand up, walk out the door, and never look at the laptop again. He stared at the power cord snaking across the floor. One sharp tug would end the noise, the frustration, and the relentless pressure to perform. His heart hammered against his ribs, an erratic rhythm that echoed the silence of the apartment. He tried to straighten his spine, but his muscles refused the command. He was trapped in the geometry of his own failure. Every object in the room, the stack of unpaid bills, the empty coffee mugs, the flickering monitor seemed to mock his ambition. He gripped the armrests until his skin went pale, fighting the urge to shatter the screen and walk away into the quiet, empty street outside. He was at the absolute edge of his endurance. The power cord remained plugged in. Elias let go of the armrests, his fingers stiff from the tension. He did not pull the plug. Instead, he gripped his pen, the plastic casing biting into his palm. He turned away from the screen and looked at the stack of blank paper on his desk. He started over, not with code, but with a list of questions. He wrote down every function that failed, every error code that flashed, and every assumption he had made. He opened his browser, not to the project, but to the forums he had ignored for weeks. He began typing queries, stripping away his pride to ask for help. He sent emails to developers whose work he admired, attaching his logs and his failures as evidence of his effort. The room remained quiet, but his hands stayed busy. He moved from the desk to the bookshelf, pulling down technical manuals he had shelved months ago. He spread them out, cross-referencing his current nightmare against the foundational principles he had forgotten. He poured a fresh cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cold air, and sat back down. He did not look at the clock. He looked at the syntax. He began to read, line by line, mapping the logic until the patterns in the error logs started to align with the solutions in the books. He was no longer fighting the machine, he was studying it. The solution did not arrive as a sudden epiphany, but as a small, quiet alignment of logic. Elias typed a single line, deleted it, and replaced a semicolon with a colon. He hit the compile key. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic pulse that felt like a heartbeat. The screen turned white, then loaded. Lines of data began to scroll, faster and faster, steady and unbroken. He leaned forward, his nose inches from the glass. The error messages were gone. The program was running, executing every function exactly as he had mapped it in his notebook. He sat back, his chest rising and falling in a long, shaky breath. He clicked through the interface, testing the inputs. Every button responded. Every command triggered the correct output. The weight that had held him to the chair for weeks evaporated. He stared at the glowing monitor, watching the data stream flow without a single stutter. It worked. He reached out and touched the screen, his fingertips tracing the path of the code he had built from scratch. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was clean. He closed the browser, saved the project, and watched the file icon appear on his desktop. The impossible was now a finished, functioning reality. He leaned back, his muscles finally loosening, as the monitor light bathed the desk in a steady, unblinking glow. Elias uploaded the final file to his server. He refreshed the page, watching the browser render his portfolio. It was clean, functional, and live. He leaned back, the screen illumination fading as the sun began to dip behind the neighboring buildings. He stood up, stretched his arms, and walked to the small window, looking down at the street. He was about to turn back to his desk when a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the silence. Someone was knocking at his door. He froze, his hand still on the window frame. He had not expected anyone. He straightened his posture, took a breath, and walked to the door. He turned the handle and pulled it open. A woman stood in the hallway, holding a tablet under her arm. She did not hesitate. She looked past him, her eyes landing directly on the glowing monitor inside the room. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold of his office, and set her tablet on his desk. She pointed at the screen, her finger tracing the interface he had built. She looked at him and spoke. "I saw your work online," she said. "I have a project that needs this exact logic." The invisible effort of his late nights had finally gained a witness. The woman scrolled through the pages on her tablet, her eyes scanning the lines of code and the project documentation. She stopped at the final module, tapping the glass. She looked up at Elias, her expression professional and direct. She opened her bag and pulled out a stack of paper, sliding it across the desk. It was a standard service agreement. Elias looked at the document. It was not a fortune. The figures listed were modest, covering only the initial development costs and a small retainer. But as he read the clauses, the reality of the offer settled in. This was not a theoretical exercise anymore. It was a transaction. He reached into his drawer, pulled out a pen, and felt the weight of it in his hand. He hesitated for a second, the ink hovering over the signature line. He thought of the empty nights and the months of silence. He pressed the pen down and signed his name. The scratching of the nib against the paper sounded loud in the small room. He handed the document back. She checked the signature, nodded once, and tucked the paper away. She stood up, offered a firm handshake, and walked out the door. Elias remained seated, staring at the empty space on his desk where the contract had been. The room was quiet again, but the air felt different. His work had finally created a tangible result in the world. The silence in the office no longer felt empty. It felt like space waiting to be filled. Elias turned his gaze back to his monitor. He opened his project logs, listing every cold email sent, every bug encountered, and every hour spent reading documentation. He saw the pattern now. Each of those isolated, frustrating moments had not been a dead end. They were bricks. He pulled a fresh notebook from his drawer and began to map his next project, not as a desperate attempt at success, but as a systematic expansion of his foundation. He calculated the hours required, mapped the necessary skills, and set his alarm for 5 a.m. The temptation to sleep was still there, but it no longer carried the weight of failure. He understood the mechanism of his own progress. He spent the next 3 hours refining his workflow, stripping away unnecessary tasks, and focusing only on the work that generated momentum. He was no longer reacting to the world. He was building his own. He stood up, walked to the window, and watched the city lights flicker. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, but he had already laid the first few layers of his own life. He was the architect, the laborer, and the witness to his own steady rise. 10 years of mornings have passed since the alarm first dictated his direction. Elias stands now on the 40th floor, his hands resting against the glass partition of a corner office. Below him, the city is a grid of moving lights and intersecting streets, a massive machine that once felt like a cage. He watches the traffic flow through the arteries of the downtown core. The scale of the view is immense, yet he sees it with the clarity of a man who built his position brick by brick. He traces the horizon where the steel towers meet the darkening sky. The silence here is different. It is the silence of altitude, detached from the frantic pulse of the streets far below. He takes a slow breath, feeling the temperature of the glass beneath his fingertips. Every window in the district represents 1,000 hours of labor, 1,000 decisions, and 1,000 mornings where the choice to work outweighed the urge to rest. He is no longer a passenger watching the world drift by from the driver's seat of a parked car. He is part of the architecture of the city itself. He turns away from the glass, the floor beneath his feet solid and unchanging. The perspective from this height is the result of years spent on the ground, doing the work that no one else saw. He turns back to the desk, the polished mahogany surface cool under his palms. He opens the top drawer, reaching past modern devices to find a small, battered notebook with frayed edges. The paper inside is yellowed, marked by ink stains and frantic handwritten lists from a decade ago. He runs his thumb over the indentations where the pen had pressed too hard, a physical map of his early frustration. He closes his eyes, and the high-rise office fades. He is back in the cramped room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of a flickering radiator. He remembers the weight of the bills on the desk and the crushing desire to simply stay under the covers. He feels the phantom pressure of that morning alarm, the exact moment his hand reached out to break the cycle. He opens his eyes, staring at the small, dark room his memory has reconstructed. He is no longer looking at a stranger. He is looking at the man who chose to wake up when everything felt impossible. That version of himself is still here, anchored in the discipline that sustained him before the success arrived. He traces the first entry in the old book, a simple goal written in shaky script, and acknowledges the gravity of that single, quiet decision. The view from the window is not a trophy. It is a ledger. People see the height of the office, the clean lines of the furniture, and the silence of his success, but they do not see the math behind it. He calculates the years, the weeks, and the thousands of mornings that were never recorded in any headline. There was no single explosion of luck. There was only the sound of the alarm at 5, the movement of his feet against cold floorboards, and the steady friction of a pen against paper. Every hour spent hunched over a keyboard while the rest of the world slept served as a single, invisible brick. He considers the total weight of those mornings. They were not dramatic. They were repetitive. They were often boring. Yet, without the accumulation of those singular, quiet efforts, this office would not exist. He taps the desk, feeling the density of the wood. This is the architecture of persistence. He realizes that the version of himself who stared at the blank screen in the dark was already building this room. The success he holds now is simply the visible surface of a foundation laid in the shadows, built one morning at a time, long before anyone else arrived to notice. Elias sets the old notebook aside and pulls a fresh, blank sheet of paper toward him. He picks up his pen. The weight of the instrument is familiar, balanced by years of constant use. He does not hesitate. He writes the first task for tomorrow, then the second and the third. The ink flows dark and steady against the white surface. He knows that the view outside his Arado will be there again when the sun rises, but the office is not a destination. It is a station. The process never reaches a final stop. He looks at the list, the roadmap for the next day, and realizes that the seeds he plants today are the only things that guarantee the harvest of tomorrow. He caps the pen with a sharp, metallic click. The sound echoes in the quiet room, final and deliberate. He stands up and walks toward the door, leaving the desk ready for the morning. He does not look back at the city lights. He is already focused on the 5 o'clock hour. He knows what he has to do. He reaches for the light switch, plunges the room into shadow, and prepares for the cycle to begin again before the world wakes up.